I think most of you know my name is Frank Chalk, and I'm the director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. The media have been giving me credit for organizing this conference, but the people who really organized it are some of the people who are sitting around here. Kyle Matthews, who conceived the idea of this conference, Alexandra Buskey, who's been working with him, and Claire Narcisse Merveille, who's worked right along with us as one of the conference organizers, and a whole bunch of interns and wonderful volunteers. So I want to thank all of them and recognize them appropriately at the beginning. And I'd also like to just take this opportunity to recognize our co-sponsors and partners before I launch into the formal part of our discussion this evening. First of all, our promotional partners, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide and Other Crimes Against Humanity, the Canadian Federation of University Women, which was actually the first group to throw its weight behind the recommendations of our Will to Intervene report, the Canadian Lawyers for International Human Rights, the Enough Project, General Dallaire's Child Soldiers Initiative, the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect, the Montreal Council on Foreign Relations, the Satellite Sentinel Project, sponsored by George Clooney and represented by Mr. Hudson tonight, the wonderful Vancouver-based Simons Foundation, and Jennifer Simons and her team, who very early gave us a lot of the resources to help us operate, the Walrus Foundation, and of course our own Will to Intervene project, which Kyle heads. Our media partners are the Global Brief magazine and Embassy magazine. And our conference donors are Concordia University, without whose support none of this could be happening, the Aurea Foundation in Toronto, the Canadian Commission for UNESCO, the Canadian International Council, Montreal branch, the Quebec Ministry of International Relations, and the Canadian Department of National Defense's Security and Defense Forum. So our deep thanks to all of these helpers and facilitators who have really made this conference a reality. In September 2007, Romeo Dallaire and I launched our Will to Intervene project at the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. 6 years earlier, the Canadian-sponsored International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty had produced its landmark report, The Responsibility to Protect. Running like a scarlet thread, connecting both events, stood our memories of the Rwanda genocide of 1994 and the Srebrenica genocide 1 year later. Tonight, the world notes the fall and the death of Muammar Gaddafi, bringing to a crashing conclusion his despotic reign of 42 years. And to answer the question that all of you have at the back of your minds, no, Kyle and I did not know half a year ago that this would be the day that he came down. But we had our suspicions. The cascading ripples across national boundaries of the Arab Spring turned into a tsunami. The deaths of Mohamed Bouazizi of Tunisia and Khalid Said of Egypt brought us to the verge of this tipping point. And the basic doctrine of the responsibility to protect, whose 10th anniversary we celebrate tonight, the idea that states have primary responsibility for the protection of their own citizens until they violate that principle by murdering their own citizens en masse, which opens the door to international protection, finally breached the barriers of resistance to that doctrine in the case of Libya. In February of this year, the Security Council adopted Resolution 1970, reminding Gaddafi and his government ministers that they had a responsibility to protect their citizens, not to kill them, and that they would suffer consequences if they persisted and tried to implement the threat to destroy the people of Benghazi like cockroaches. NATO's military intervention in Libya is not the poster child of the responsibility to protect. Diplomacy and development assistance are far better and can head off mass atrocities and build the conditions that make peace, order, and good government possible. And we much prefer those tools when necessary. But tonight, R2P has shown that it also has teeth, and that under the right circumstances, when applying its principles, they have a chance of success. Military action is possible and will be undertaken if there are no other options, and the other important principle of R2P, we believe we can succeed and do more good than harm. American poet Robert Frost spoke for us when he wrote, "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." I think I can say with General Dallaire and Kyle Matthews and many of you in this room that we all recognize that tonight is only a beginning in Libya, a chance for the people of Libya to show what they can really do, and a beginning for the international community, which has shown that when brought to confront imminent mass atrocities, it does have the will to act, and it has the capacity to act, but in a very nuanced and extremely delicate way, which is how the NATO operation unfolded. We are living in a revolutionary era. For the first time in the history of the human race, mass murder is widely condemned, and courts of law are holding a growing number of perpetrators accountable for the crimes they committed against civilians in the midst of civil conflicts and simply out of their whims to dominate and to repress their people. I want to remind you that the resolution passed by the Security Council highlighted the responsibility to protect. It was the first resolution in the history of the Security Council to do so. For many UN delegates, these resolutions on Libya, not just 1970, but the succeeding resolutions, marked a major advance towards implementing the responsibility of states to protect their own people and initiating intercession by the Security Council when states have failed to satisfy that responsibility. The responsibility to protect is really gaining traction among the permanent members of the Security Council for the very first time. The new United States National Security Strategy, promulgated in May 2010, recognizes for the first time that the primary responsibility for preventing genocide and mass atrocities rests with sovereign governments, but that this responsibility passes to the broader international community when sovereign governments themselves commit genocide or mass atrocities, or when they prove unable or unwilling to take necessary action to prevent or respond to such crimes inside their borders. Now, I wouldn't repeat that principle here, except for the fact that it's embedded within the new U.S. national security strategy. So this is not coming from the usual NGO suspects. This is coming from the highest levels of the Obama administration. In the words of the national security strategy, the United States has committed itself to working with our allies and to strengthening our own internal capabilities in order to ensure that the United States and the international community are proactively engaged in a strategic effort to prevent mass atrocities and genocide. And in the event that prevention fails, the United States will work both multilaterally and bilaterally to mobilize diplomatic, humanitarian, financial, and in certain instances, military means to prevent and respond to genocide and mass atrocities. The media also are changing. Today's potential victims of mass atrocities are empowered by electronic tools which allow them to communicate their plight in real time with the hope that they might cooperate among themselves to save themselves, to coordinate their actions domestically. And this takes priority over sending messages to the international community asking to be rescued. The most, and I would say greatest significance of the new electronic media from the point of view of the potential victims of mass atrocities is their ability to allow the potential victims to cooperate and coordinate their actions to defend themselves. It's only later, if that fails, when they call on us, whether it's through Twitter or Facebook or internet messages, etc., that these wonderful new tools actually come into our laps and we have to make some decisions. Joined with traditional media to expose looming mass atrocities and political leaders willing to rally against them, the unprecedented new media offer exciting possibilities for prevention. Yet we still have a great deal to learn. Innovative media technologies pose new problems that call for ingenious solutions. SMS text messages, tweets, Facebook pages, and blogs have opened the floodgates, swamping analysts with wave after wave of information. Verifying social media messages requires advances in information forensics, including software tools and cross-checking techniques to distinguish facts from rumors and to ensure the authenticity and accuracy of messages. Ultimately, the combination of new technology and old media will combat the isolation of victims, while radio and television broadcasts of serial media dramas, what we call edutainment dramas, will help to establish common ground between groups in conflict. But we will still face our old enemies, censorship and domestic repression, and we will have to address them with the people who live in those countries in the forefront. Even more subtly, if media coverage and public pressure are to galvanize into action the political leadership needed to prevent mass atrocities, reporting will have to become more anticipatory, sustained, rooted in a deeper understanding of processes more than immediate events, offer a knowledgeable framework of interpretation, and move consumers of news away from efforts to drag them towards extreme nationalism, sensationalism, very narrow sources of information, hyper-emotionalism, strongly biased and inaccurate stories, and other instruments of psychological manipulation. And Dov Shinar, who's one of our presenters, has a project to address some of these needs, and I'm very happy that I may become part of it at some point in the future. Now, achieving these goals is a tall order to fulfill, especially at a time when strained budgets and dwindling foreign bureaus threaten massive cuts in international news coverage. But we must fulfill these goals. Towards those ends, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies of Concordia University has convened this conference. And we've done it quite deliberately on the 10th anniversary of the Responsibility to Protect, because we think the synergies between the new media, the old media, and the doctrines of the responsibility to protect are absolutely fundamental and enormous. When it comes to Syria, when it comes to Sudan, when it comes to Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and other sites of mass atrocities, where people like Joseph Kony, Bashir, and others persist, whether it's from Damascus or Khartoum or from other sites, we have to apply nuanced analyses, choose our battles carefully, and find not only energetic partners, but intelligent partners who have the political shrewdness to be able to cobble together the necessary alliances and build the necessary measures together to produce peace, order, and good government in their own societies. Paul Martin, Romeo Dallaire, Carol Off, Rick McInnes-Ray, Alan Thompson, Andre Pratt, Andrew Potter, Gordon Smith, Dov Shinar, and a host of distinguished journalists, scholars, practitioners, and political leaders will be our guides during this conference. But you, our audience in this room and out there in cyberspace, will have the chance to participate by sending us questions and comments. So if you'd like to join the discussion, and particularly if you're not here at the conference, I urge you to use Twitter to reach us by using hashmark MIGS, M-I-G-S, R2, the number, P. And with that, I would like now to turn the floor over to my colleague, Dr. Fred Lowy, who is going to join in welcoming you. Thank you, Dr. Lowy.
Thank you very much, Frank, Professor Chalk. Merci tout le monde, chers conférenciers et distingués invités. Je vous souhaite tous et toutes la bienvenue, une chaleureuse bienvenue ici à l'Université Concordia. J'aimerais saluer en particulier le très honorable M. Paul Martin, ex-Premier ministre du Canada, et les autres distingués invités. It's a rare conference that can attract a former Prime Minister, former Minister of Justice, a former top diplomat in the Canadian Diplomatic Service, all sitting here together. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this particular conference organized by Concordia University. We're very, very proud of the work that Professor Chalk's team has done. He and Romeo Dallaire and Kyle Matthews and their colleagues have really, I think, made a very important contribution. And it's a contribution, of course, that we as Canadians all welcome, but also we as members of the Concordia family are very, very proud of. Now, the role of media, of course, increasingly takes center stage. One only has to look at recent headlines from around the world to understand the long-standing quest for human rights. It's a daily struggle for many people in many, many countries. And the global media chronicle this struggle. They get the story behind the events, and hopefully they help us to make sense of it all. But what's perhaps not fully recognized, sadly, is that members of the media around the world pay dearly, many of them, in personal terms for their efforts to tell the story accurately and truthfully. I have here in front of me a chilling statistic. Reporters Without Borders has a press freedom barometer. It's a nonprofit organization that most of you know. They show that so far, and in 2011, and we're only in October, at least 52 journalists have been killed. 159 have been known to be jailed. 125 cyber citizens, also, as far as is known, have been imprisoned. And people closer to the scene believe that these are very understated figures. Now, those who help the media also, they're vulnerable as well to harm, imprisonment, sometimes far worse. As we can see from the recent kidnappings in Kenya, Frontline humanitarian workers, including journalists, are often at great personal risk. And of course, this represents only a very small part of the price that societies across the globe pay in the fight for human rights. We hope that universities throughout the world, such as Concordia, maintain a commitment to excellence in directed teaching, research, and community engagement that can at least help or try to help find some usable solutions. We've seen this in the contributions to the dialogue and to policy making on human rights made by such people as Frank Chalk and his colleagues in the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. Very briefly, we at Concordia are very proud of these efforts, and I said earlier that these are really part of our Concordia mission. Every university tries to distinguish itself in certain ways, and one of the things that we're very proud of is that our students, our professors, our staff, our administrators are community-oriented, and we hope globally oriented. And there's no better reflection of this, in fact, than the work of Professor Chalk's group. Now, whether our students support a local homeless shelter here in Montreal, or orphan children in Uganda and the Dominican Republic, as they have been doing, or complete an internship at foreign newspapers, as some are doing right now, or civil society groups in developing countries elsewhere, they're doing the kind of work that we feel extremely proud of. Now, of course, aside from our traditional task of creating and transmitting knowledge, conducting research into human rights, contributing to policy solutions, as Frank Chalk's group have, hosting important conferences like this one, universities generally can help stop mass atrocities, or at least contribute to that, by preparing the next generation to be part of the solution. Perhaps those generations will be engaged as journalists, as human rights scholars, perhaps as human rights activists. Perhaps they'll be engaged as professionals, contributing to the struggle for human rights by sharing their knowledge and their expertise with the global community. There are many ways in which people can help. However they do it, we expect that those of our students who pass through our doors will be concerned citizens of the world, influenced in the best possible way by the values espoused by this and exemplified by this conference. On behalf of my colleagues at Concordia, we thank you very much for coming. We wish everybody, of course, a memorable and informative conference, and we thank you very much for coming and look forward to Mr. Martin's talk. Thank you very much.
Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle Kyle Matthews et je suis le chef du projet La Volonté d'Intervenir. Thank you for coming to Montreal on this cold and rainy night. It's much nicer during the summer than late October. This past spring, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times wrote a very important piece. And what he wrote was to counter the critics of the response to Libya. And he said this, he said, "But just because we allowed Rwandans or Darfuris to be massacred, does it really follow that to be consistent, we should allow Libyans to be massacred as well? Isn't it better to inconsistently save some lives than to consistently save none?" Ladies and gentlemen, this is the promise of the responsibility to protect, that the international community will improve its less than stellar record in confronting mass atrocity crimes. It's a promise that we will not sit in our hands when a government decides to kill its own people. I can think of no better person tonight to open our conference as a keynote speaker than the Right Honourable Paul Martin. For those of you, and all Canadians know who Paul Martin is, but for those following from Africa, from Russia, from other parts of the world, I'm going to give a short, brief bio. The Right Honourable Paul Martin was the 21st Prime Minister of Canada from 2003 to 2006. He was a Minister of Finance during the period of 93 to 2002, and he balanced the budget. We're very lucky to have him tonight, because many governments in Europe would pay a lot of money to have him give him advice right now. So we're very, very fortunate. And Mr. Martin, in September 1999, Mr. Martin was named the inaugural chair of the Finance Ministers G20. And a very important note is that Mr. Martin was the co-chair with the late Nobel Prize winner, Laureate Wangari Maathai, of a $200 million British-Norwegian poverty alleviation project and sustainable development fund for the 10-nation Congo Basin rainforest. And I understand from my contacts that this evening, Mr. Martin joined with Desiree McGraw and the Sauvé Scholars to plant a tree in her honor. Now, Mr. Martin also sits on the Advisory Council of the Coalition of Dialogue in Africa, an initiative that examines critical issues facing the continent. It is sponsored by the African Union, the UN Economic Development Commission, and the African Development Bank. He's also a member of the International Monetary Fund's Western Hemispheric Regional Advisory Group. Now, some of you might be asking, why is Paul Martin speaking here tonight? What's his connection to the Responsibility to Protect? He was a finance minister, he was a prime minister, but let me tell you this. The thing about journalists, especially private ones, is that they don't always report on leadership. They only respond and report on issues that make you look bad. And I would like to say that leadership matters, and there's basically 5 points here I'd like to make about Mr. Martin, why he's speaking here tonight. When he was prime minister, him and his government brought together all 192 states sitting at the UN in 2005 to sign on to the Responsibility to Protect. That's tremendous, especially in the aftermath of the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. When he was prime minister, he formed an advisory group to protect civilians in Darfur to respond to the genocide, which his advisory group was our Ambassador Bob Fowler, a former ambassador to the UN, Romeo Dallaire, and Mobina Jaffer. And one thing about leadership, that it has a lasting impact. You might leave political office, but it continues on. And his appointment of General Dallaire to the Senate went on, that decision by him went on to lead to the creation of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide, which is one of our sponsors this evening. And later on, that same leadership decision led to Senator Dallaire joining MIGS as senior fellow and founding with Professor Dr. Chalk the W2I project, which now I'm in gainful employment of it. And followed by that, we've had a whole series of NGOs, many who are here tonight, think tanks, institutes, such as the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect and the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, that would have never, ever been in place now if not for the leadership of Mr. Martin. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Paul Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. Ladies and gentlemen, before I go any further, Kyle, those governments that are going to pay a lot of money for that advice, if you give them my phone number. C'est un grand honneur pour moi d'être ici ce soir. Je suis ici vraiment pour vous parler de la responsabilité de protéger, mais aussi pour féliciter ceux et celles qui sont responsables pour l'organisation de cette soirée et vraiment pour l'initiative que vous mettez de l'avant. C'est vraiment très important. It's a great honor for me to have been asked to open this conference marking the 10th anniversary of the Responsibility to Protect. But in doing so, I want to congratulate Kyle Matthews for all of the work that he and the others around him have done. I want to congratulate you, Dr. Chalk. I want to congratulate you for what you have stood for really through your whole professorial career. And while he's not here tonight, I want to thank and congratulate my old friend, Romeo Dallaire. Let me simply say that in and out of uniform, in his career and in his writings, there are very few people who have touched Canadians the way that Romeo Dallaire has. And I want to say here that if we are here to discuss the responsibility to protect, on other occasions, child soldiers or whatever, Romeo Dallaire is not only an outstanding Canadian, he is an outstanding citizen of the world. Et Dr. Lowy, je veux vous féliciter, et vraiment l'Université Concordia, parce que l'initiative de ce soir est vraiment un chef-d'œuvre pour nous Canadiens et certainement pour l'université. Well, as has been said, the concept of R2P was born of the conflicts of the 1990s. From Srebrenica to Rwanda, from Darfur to Somalia, then and even today, the international community has stood by while atrocities that stagger the human conscience have taken place. Bogged down in debates over what constitutes a threat to our common humanity, blinded by national self-interest and a dated definition of sovereignty, the international community continues to find itself unable to prevent human atrocities of the kind we continually promise will never happen again. I think that we all feel that we have done something quite significant in Libya. Dr. Chalk talked about that. I would wonder, Dr. Chalk, you may want to discuss this tomorrow, if Muammar Gaddafi had not, in a fateful broadcast, essentially said that he was going to eliminate his people from the face of the earth if they continue their protest, would we have reacted the way that we did? I hope so. I hope so, but I think the question is worth addressing. R2P gives legal standing and power to the United Nations Security Council to intervene in a country without twisting itself into circles over the definition of genocide, that is to say, on the grounds of humanitarian emergency alone. What it does is to recognize the inalienable right to life and the duty to uphold that right. Quite simply, it allows the international community, as has been said, to intervene in a crisis when action is required. Now, Canada has been, as you know, an active supporter of the resolution. In fact, under Lloyd Axworthy, I believe that we were the initiator. And I can see that, for instance, Minister Irwin Cotler is here. Now, Irwin, as the Minister of Justice, made R2P a centerpiece of his international justice agenda when heading up the Canadian delegation to Stockholm, the Stockholm Conference, in January 9, 2004. Irwin also intervened in the Mugesera case, which resulted in the Supreme Court ordering Mugesera's deportation for his state-sanctioned incitement to genocide in Rwanda in 1994. In fact, I've got a long list here of things that Irwin did, but since he didn't tell me about it when I was Prime Minister, I don't think I'll mention him here today. Anyway, when you take a look at how what Canada has done so far, so good. However, that being said, no one can really deny that there are not real challenges with the implementation of R2P. Thus the reasons for the importance of this conference. Through the will to intervene, all of you have done significant work in bridging the gap between rhetoric on the one hand and implementation on the other. And your analysis and your recommendations have a great deal to commend them. That being said, however, given that I am to speak as a prelude to the discussions, I'd like to offer a few comments for your consideration, comments designed to support points that you have raised. Did none of you drink water? First, in the report you say, and I'd like to quote, CETA should increase and target development assistance to reach countries where the threat of mass atrocities is most likely, end of quote. Now, what you say is true here. There's no doubt about that. But I wonder if your analysis doesn't understate the threat that we face. Now, that threat is a different one than many of you might identify. That threat, in my opinion, is that the current financial crisis will last much longer than is being projected, and that it will be the segment of ODA that would otherwise be directed towards fragile states that will bear much of the burden of government restraint and fiscal austerity. I say this because, in my experience, in ODA budgets, such funding, the kind of emergency funding that we're talking about that would be necessary for R2P, is not part of protected programming and is therefore very, very vulnerable to the accountant's knife. And in my opinion, this represents, if not the greatest obstacle to the responsibility to protect, it certainly is the greatest threat to the responsibility to prevent. For instance, Africa has the greatest number of fragile, failing, and failed states in the world. In 2030, it's projected to have a population of 1.5 billion. That will be equal, or if not greater, to each of China and India at that time. But even more to the point, Africa will have the largest population of young people, essentially young men, anywhere on the planet. And if given the right chance to succeed, that massive percentage of young people has the potential to be the world's engine of growth, comparable to what China is today. However, if they are unemployed, if they are rootless, millions of desperate young people with little hope but plenty of anger, they will become the greatest threat to Africa's stability and ultimately, let me remind you, to ours. One only has to look at Somalia to see the potential future at work. That failed state is now linked, as you know, to international terrorism, to piracy in the Gulf of Aden, and is a huge source of the region's instability. Now, true clans and fundamentalism have played a role in all of this. But the fact is, the inability of Somalia to respond to its own needs without outside help has been tragically evident from the beginning. In short, we've been warned. Second comment. You raise the use of sanctions. And you're right to do so. However, in focusing primarily on actions to be taken by Canada and the United States, and I know you want to go beyond, but the ones that I have read have been primarily in that area, I wonder if it wouldn't be better to deal more quickly with the reality of the world, not as it was, but as it is today. I say this because the end of the American unipolar world has its consequences, and they cannot be ignored. In short, if a return to multipolarity is inevitable, then finding the means whereby all of the great powers can pursue universal values in the global interest becomes essential. Now, I raised this in my speech to the UN on R2P when I referred somewhat obliquely to the concept of the G20 at a time when I was seeking to have it introduced at the leaders' level. And if you'll forgive me for citing myself, because, well, what the hell, nobody else will, I said, and I quote, "The world is organized into independent states, and the primary obligation of government is to look after its people." It's absolutely brilliant. I then went on to say, "This presents us with a fundamental dilemma. For unless we also act collectively on the basis of our common humanity, the rich will become richer, the poor will become poorer, and hundreds of millions of people will be at risk. Thus, we need institutions whose primary obligation is to our common humanity." End of quote. Now, one of the institutions that I was referring to was the G20, and its importance lies, I believe, in the instance that we are addressing tonight. The G20's role is not limited to finance. Let us understand that. Quite simply, there is no issue of global concern that is not within the G20's purview. However, its members have different political and different economic systems, and there are significant cultural differences between them that have to be bridged. And thus, the G20's greatest role may well be that it provides a venue for leaders to address their collective challenges, their collective responsibilities, enabling them to come to common ground over time, despite their different starting points, in a way that more formal institutions never could. And this, for example, on issues such as sanctions that would allow the UN resolution on the R2P to fulfill its mandate. For example, recently the UN Security Council fell short on the support needed to implement full sanctions against Syria because Russia and China vetoed the resolution. Now, it's here, I believe, that the G20 can help prepare the way ahead through the kinds of international give and take, peer pressure, long before crises reach the crucial point, the tipping point. Quite simply, it takes time to build consensus, time to build the understanding, time to build the trust required to build global support for new initiatives that run counter to one's history. And thus, I believe the need for the G20 to meet regularly. Hopefully, there'll come a time when crises will no longer be the prime focus of the G20. But it will be important that they meet so that nations that have different cultures, different backgrounds, different ways of looking at things are able to understand each other. And under this basis, nor should the effectiveness of personal diplomacy at the leaders' level ever be underestimated. Gordon Smith has talked about this. At the UN, and Dr. Chalk in his remarks talked about it, Canada's UN ambassador, Alan Rock, in fact, led the negotiations in support of R2P, which eventually led to its adoption. At a critical point in the debates, he asked if I would call some of the leaders who were opposed to that idea, but whom I knew well. People like Prime Minister Aziz of Pakistan, Patterson of Jamaica, President Bouteflika of Algeria, Ricardo Lagos of Chile, and a number of others. Now, these were all leaders who might have supported the concept, but who really mistrusted the motives of the people who were promoting it. So I worked the phones, and in the end, most either supported it or did not vote against it. Now, I'm sure my phone calls weren't the only reason, but they didn't hurt. And if they worked, it was because of the friendships that had been formed at various summits over the years, either as Prime Minister or as Minister of Finance. And that's the advantage of the G20 over time. In fact, it leads me to my third comment. That comment is, you begin, again, quite properly, by discussing the role in Canada and the United States, and Kyle and I have talked about this. But my comment is the need to expand your network beyond Canada and the U.S. as quickly as you can. Clearly, you have to start somewhere. But I believe the quicker you build that global network, the more successful you will be. When Canada started the movement to elevate the G20, from the finance ministers to the leaders, it did so first at the political level. But underpinning that effort, and I believe the reason for its ultimate success at the leaders level, was the network of universities, of individuals, and NGOs in other key countries that was built up as a result of the reach out, the reaching across borders of certain Canadian think tanks. Now, Gordon Smith is here to talk on a panel tomorrow. I'm not sure what he's going to be talking about, but I would suggest to you that you might well at this conference ask him about that effort, the effort to reach out, because he led it. He and a bunch of other Canadians across the country essentially went to the States, went to China, went to Africa, went to India, went across the world, building up a network of people who basically were there, that when the politicians decided we're going to elevate it to the leaders level, and they reached out for the intellectual support to do it, was there. This was a Canadian initiative, and I would very much hope that this Canadian initiative, Kyle, that you and Dr. Chalk and Romeo Dallaire are doing, can build up the same kind of network. Now, my fourth and last suggestion is that you discuss the need to build and to maintain national military forces capable of robust intervention outside of those forces provided by the United States. Now, I say this because some supporters of R2P advocate quite properly for greater investment in soft power like ODA and diplomacy. But then, when crunch time comes, they shy away from supporting the military. The fact is, the opportunity cost of military spending is not an issue of butter for bullets. It is a question of the capability to act. For example, the NATO-led no-fly zone over Libya was able to impede the potential for civilian atrocity that was threatened by Gaddafi. However, without the military technology of the United States, this would not have been as successful. The Allies could have fallen well short of the capacity to implement and sustain Operation Unified Protector. Both the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, and the current Secretary, Leon Panetta, have explicitly lectured the NATO nations on the need to share the burden of international security. In short, there is no guarantee that the United States will be the leading player in the next crisis. And therefore, those who are outside of the United States, who call for a reduction of their own military budgets, must recognize the consequences when considering the future effectiveness of R2P. Well, time rolls along. As I said at the beginning, I was asked to introduce the debate, and in light of my last point on military spending, I was asked to provide you with some ammunition for tonight's discussion. So let me not put that discussion off any longer. Let me simply say that I believe in the responsibility to protect, and I believe equally in building strongly the support for its implementation, a process which has been too long delayed, and which, if not discussed here and then around the world and not put into practice, will mean that the concept that all of us have worked so hard for will be empty. So for this reason, let me thank you, and let me congratulate you once again. Depends on the questions. I may need more than water. All right, I am told by Kyle that we're to have questions.
15 minutes of questions before Mr. Martin has to go, so please line up, everybody.
So much, okay.
Well, I'll jump in, brash American. Jonathan Hudson from the Enough Project in Washington, D.C. Given that Muammar Gaddafi has died today, and we're here commemorating the 10th anniversary of R2P, I think one question that people in Sudan are now wondering is, why was the international community so prompt to act when the Gaddafi regime was bombarding its own people in Benghazi, and yet on a daily basis, the Khartoum regime continues to bombard people in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile State in Sudan, and the world does nothing?
Well, in the same, you could probably ask the same question in terms of Darfur prior to this. I think Dr. Chalk actually answered that question in his introduction. He said you've got to pick your spots, I mean, I think that you've got to pick your spots. I think you've got to pick your spots where you win, where you can win, and where you're sure that you can bring sufficient people on side to win. I mean, you know, I've got to say, and we're all speaking personally here, but I mean, the fact that Germany did not join in Libya, I think is you know, just demonstrates that this is, to bring everybody on side is not an easy thing. But the only reason that I can give you is that I think you've got to pick your spots. And I go back to the comment that I made, and I don't know if somebody else wants to say it, but you know, Syria, Libya, Gaddafi statement, nothing from Assad, and we move on Libya. I don't know, or I do know, I think actually, but well. The man who should have answered that question has just arrived, Senator Dallaire. It is a pleasure. We said great things in your absence, and so just you remember that when you talk about me. Yeah, plaisir de vous voir. Yes.
Hello, Felix von Geyer. I'm very well, thank you. Great to see you again. I know there's quite a lot of cynicism out there. People like Michel Chossudovsky, other people will actually say, well, this right to protect business seems to be like a masquerade for a resource grab and things like that. And I'm just wondering, what kind of response do you have to this sense of cynicism?
Well, let me just say that at the time that Canada, and we did, Canada was leading the fight at the United Nations, that was in part what you heard from a number of the leaders who were in fact opposed to it. You know, is this simply another way of effecting regime changes at the whim of the G8? Or is this a territorial grab? Is this simply 21st century colonialism? And it had to be the argument that to say this was not the case, and that there were going to be means by which, you know, the right to protect was going to be installed. It was going to be debated before we would go. I think that cynicism does exist, but you know, I guess probably the best answer that I can give you to that question is Africa, the African nations initially opposed the responsibility to protect. Right. I spoke to a number of them and a number of their key leaders. Trevor Manuel, who was not president, but Trevor, who was their Minister of Finance, when I spoke to a number of the other African leaders, and you could see that they were debating the issue. And then, you know, I'll tell you something, an interesting thing happened. They had a meeting among themselves, and they came back and said, you know, this is not something that's coming from the developed world. The responsibility to protect essentially is saying to we Africans, we've got to protect ourselves, and it's got to be, and they installed the principles of the responsibility to protect are now part of the African Union Charter. And I think that's probably the best answer that I can give you to your question.
Thank you.
Mr. Martin, Alan Thompson from Carleton University, and sort of the Toronto Star, I guess.
Hello, Alan.
You were a Prime Minister.
That was.
One of the things we're trying to figure out tomorrow is how the news media could be more effective in drawing attention to mass atrocity, sparking decision makers like yourself to take action and to do things. And so I'm wondering, I'm not sure if people have asked you to look back at your time as Prime Minister and try to assess how did the news media affect your decision making. And I'm wondering if you can think of specific examples. Where did media coverage make you do something? Where did it change your mind? Where did it put you off in a new direction?
I don't think there's any doubt that media coverage has an effect on politicians, especially when they're in an election period. And there are colleagues here. Gordon Smith is here. Irwin is here. To be honest, I don't think that media coverage makes a political leader, in terms of foreign policy, do something. What I really do believe that political leaders, prime ministers, ministers of foreign affairs, ministers of whatever they happen to be, justice, whatever they do, basically take their decisions based on their analysis and the facts as they see it. But where media becomes incredibly important is the quality of the media in analyzing the decisions that have to be taken. If I was to ask something of media, is that the media have the experts in foreign affairs and in the issues that are there, not to simply react in a populist way, but to analyze the issues and come down on the issues with analysis. Because I'll tell you something, you can live with a media story that is counter to your position as long as it's a story dealing with the facts and as long as you feel confident that you've taken the right decision. So I guess my answer to you is media can help an enormous amount in the case of their analysis and in case of the facts that they may well come up. There is no doubt. I think it was Dr. Lowy who mentioned the ability of media to be on the site and to basically deal with stories in depth. I mean, there are a number of reporters across, Canadian reporters, who are incredibly knowledgeable about some of these areas, and who, in fact, you'll find the politicians will sit down and talk to them about the facts that they have got. I don't think a story does it, but I do really believe that in-depth analysis, dealing with the facts on a basis that the people who have taken the decision can respect the story, I think that helps an enormous amount.
Mr. Martin, Kyle Matthews from MIGS. One of the struggles that people working for the Responsibility to Protect that we have is that we work a lot with politicians, diplomats, NGOs, but we don't really cross-fertilize with people from the business community. I was wondering if you'd give us some tips about how we might engage the business community to actually deliver the message that the Responsibility to Protect is not just human rights, but there's also international security that can affect economic interest in the long term. Could you comment on that?
Oh yeah, I think it's very important that you do. I mean, it was mentioned, I think Dr. Chalk talked about the Congo. I mean, I know the Congo well. Look, the problem that is taking place in the Kivus is now a question of crooks essentially robbing incredibly valuable mining territories, and it is basically the Congo that is losing the revenue. I mean, you're dealing with crime in these areas. The mining industry has an enormous amount to gain from it. There's going to be I simply give you another reason. There's the AU now has a mining initiative that it is going to put forth. There's one that's being discussed by Dr. Collier at Oxford, but the AU is going to put forth a mining initiative, basically trying to say in Africa, these are the conditions under which, the safety conditions, the environmental conditions under which you're going to operate. I'll tell you, when the Africans come forth with something like that, they have one god-awful time trying to get any press at all. But I think, first of all, that so goes back to Alan Thompson's question. I think a little bit of press on an issue such that would be helpful. But in terms of the mining companies themselves, if they had better be part of the decision making in there. It's going to be too late for them to come after the fact to say, we don't like that initiative, we don't like this initiative. And the people who can actually help them with that, I think, are the NGOs and people like you, Kyle.
Thank you.
I think I got the easy line, so you should go.
Bonjour, Joëlla Chiasson, Université de Sherbrooke étudiante. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, je vous entends.
Excusez-moi, sorry. Est-ce que je peux poser ma question en français?
Oui, absolument.
OK. Dans le cas de la Libye, justement, avant que le mandat soit donné à l'OTAN, il y avait une coalition internationale.
J'ai un peu de difficulté à vous comprendre.
OK. Before the NATO...
Non, vas-y en français. Mais c'est le... It's Dr. Lowy's mic. Yeah, go ahead.
Je suis petite. Oui. OK. Avant que l'OTAN soit mandaté de défendre la Libye, justement de rendre la no-fly zone opérationnelle, il y avait une coalition internationale. Vous avez dit plutôt que justement les pays devaient mettre de l'argent dans l'armée pour justement avoir plus de forces militaires. Pensez-vous que la prochaine mise en œuvre de la responsabilité de protéger pour un Libye, on ne sait pas la Syrie ou la Côte d'Ivoire, pensez-vous qu'une coalition internationale pourrait être effective, pourrait fonctionner, contrairement à si on donnait le mandat à l'OTAN, parce que justement, c'est l'expertise des États-Unis?
Non, c'est pour ça que j'ai soulevé la question. Oui. Je pense que s'il y a une autre crise du même genre, puis si les États-Unis ne participent pas, je pense qu'on va avoir beaucoup de difficultés. Vous avez la situation, par exemple, où les Anglais sont en train General de l'aide doit le savoir, sont en train de créer un aircraft carrier. Oui. Puis ils n'ont pas les avions. Puis les Français ont les avions, puis ils n'ont pas d'aircraft carrier. Oui. Puis ils continuent comme ça. Non, il y a un problème fondamental à l'intérieur des pays de l'OTAN au point de vue de l'équipement, puis au point de vue vraiment du nombre de soldats nécessaires. Et moi, je pense que tout le monde a coupé parce que tout le monde a dit les Américains vont prendre le contrôle de tout cela. Mais là, les Américains ont dit c'est fini, là. On est endettés par-dessus la tête, puis on n'est pas capable de le faire. Puis moi, je pense qu'il va falloir... Ils nous ont avertis. Alors moi, je pense que ce soit les Français, les Allemands, les Anglais, les Canadiens, il va falloir, écoutez, si on est sincère avec la responsabilité de protéger, il va falloir investir dans le militaire.
Oui. Merci.
Merci.
Martin, my name is Naomi Kohler. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Global Center for the Responsibly Protect in New York. As a Canadian, I'm honored to be here and to also benefit from all the championing that you and Alan Rock did on this particular initiative. We work very intimately with what we call the Group of Friends of R2P, around 30 member states that have stated publicly and also privately their commitment to the Responsibly Protect and that service champions. With every election that comes, though, in a number of our Group of Friends members, we as advocates worry on whether or not their support for R2P will be maintained. I know that now with the PST-10 review in the United States, there's similar questions. Will the initiatives that are advanced be sustainable should there be a change in government? And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what are some of the ingredients that are needed at the national level to sustain these commitments to R2P, so that it's not merely something that's adopted by one government, but something that actually sustains itself for generations.
Well, I think obviously the first thing I believe is success. There's nothing that will make a government react better than something that succeeds. I think that what has happened in Libya, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that if it hadn't been for the no-fly zone and what they did, we would not have succeeded in Libya. I don't see why we would have. And so I think that what you're going to find tomorrow is considerable pride from the countries involved, and I would think that would go a long way. And I think the other one goes back to this question that I just responded to in French. You know, there are going to be enormous pressures on all governments to cut back, and in the United States, you know, particularly. And I think that the justification for military spending in terms of R2P is actually a very strong plus, but it's got to be made. Those are the two that I would that I would go to. I'll just tell you something. I remember, you know, it was Jane Goodall that came to see me one day when I was in office, and so we talked about, you know, all of her efforts with the apes, and at the end of it, I said to her, you know, Ms. Goodall, well, what would you like to see Canada do? I'm thinking would be aid money, and she said, can you fund the Security Corps to protect my aid workers because they're being killed? I think that's a very important argument, that those of us who feel very strongly about these kinds of things have got to understand, you know, that we really got to be prepared to put our money and our efforts where the problem exists. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ada Sonnenfeld, a recent graduate from McGill University in International Development. I was just wondering.
And you admit that here.
I guess so, yes. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the responsibility of the regional organizations. Because you look at somewhere like Libya, and the Arab League was very against Gaddafi and welcomed an international response, whereas somewhere in like Syria, they haven't spoken out to the same extent, and there hasn't been an international response on the level of what happened in Libya. And do you think that's just because people believe that the threat that is perceived by Bashar al-Assad is less than what Gaddafi threatened, or do you think that the regional organizations really have a big role and a big say in how the international community responds?
Well, there's no doubt that they were more reluctant at the beginning to speak out, but I must say that if you take a look at what's happened over the course of the past 2 or 3 weeks, perhaps led by Turkey, they haven't moved, but I think they have been far more vocal on the issue than, in fact, I might have thought. But I would like to, I can give you one example on a regional basis that I think is where it's working, but it could work a lot better. And again, this is something I think that Gordon, Irwin, and General Dallaire could speak to. As I mentioned in my remarks, the greatest number of failed and failing states are in Africa. This is where, this is the core of the problem. And the African Union, as I mentioned, has put it in because they deemed it for their own protection. The fact is that the UN was about 5 or 6 years ago when the UN decided that what they were going to do was to support in Africa, I believe it was 5 regional core groups. Was 5, was it, General? 5 regional core groups that would be essentially trained and staffed with the ultimate in logistical skills, training, and everything else. And Canada was to participate in a lot of that training. Now, I visited one of those corps. These are standing armies as part of existing standing armies. And I don't think they have done anywhere near what the ultimate decision was. But the basic idea behind it, in fact, was that the NATO countries, it isn't simply a function of money, it's a shortage of manpower. And that what they were really, and also the difficulty of sending non-African troops into an African country. And so the basic decision was, look, you set these up, and if you have problems in there, you will go in and deal with this issue. And they did it, but to the best of my knowledge, the success or the progress made, if it's at 50-50, then I think that would be good, although General Dallaire may have a better comment on that. Do you want to comment?
You're offering a general the opportunity to speak. Sir, the only real advantage that we've seen has been Amos and in Darfur, where in fact the African Union went in even before the UN. But it's interesting that it was Nigeria, Senegal, and Rwanda that sent in the troops. And the option of then creating a hybrid with the UN, which is probably one of the worst scenarios, could have been resolved by going with a Chapter 8 and simply reinforcing the African Union. And I believe we would have been able to do that. And so it is still embryonic in many of the 5 regions to build it.
The other thing that I really think that there is an awareness, but as the General has just said, we've got to push it. A lot of people were very surprised when, in fact, the Brazilians sent the first 5,000 troops into Haiti. And I talked to the Brazilians, and the main reason the Brazilians essentially wanted training. They wanted training in this kind of a thing because they felt that they would be called upon as part of really an emerging economy coming of date. Dr. Chalk.
Thank you very much. General Dallaire and I were together at a conference in Münster, Germany in May. And to my utter astonishment, we discovered that the old Sherbrigg idea of bringing together corps from various European countries to become part of a rapid reaction force was actually alive and well at the level of the general staffs. And the French and the Germans and the Dutch and the Germans were actually doing tabletop exercises and having all sorts of meetings. But you put your finger on the real problem. There were no troops. There were no troops. And we'll have the satisfaction in another crisis of senior officers being able to communicate over standardized instruments. But if Britain continues down the road it's on, if Germany continues down the road it's on that you referred to and alluded to, there won't be any soldiers to take those orders. We were fortunate in the case of the NATO exercise in Libya that we did not really need to put more than special forces on the grounds as the British did, perhaps. But in the future, if those troops aren't there, we're dead. Which brings me to the point that you picked up earlier, and that Kyle also referred to. The unique aspect of our Will to Intervene book is the emphasis on the fact that enforcing responsibility to protect doctrines is in the core national interest of all of the major developed countries, and that there are 5 or 6 major threats emerging from mass atrocities which will affect our prosperity, not only in the mining sector, which you correctly alluded to, but in many other areas as well, including the piracy. And one of the most important, which is so important to Africans, is the threat of pandemics. Africans have been the victims of pandemic after pandemic. If we are not able to help them, with the Africans taking the lead, to ratchet up the level of public health and to provide enough security for inoculation, vaccination, and sustained treatment with antibiotics and HIV drugs, etc., then they will suffer even more pandemics, and eventually we will inherit that. Readers of the Canadian Jewish News this week would have seen that the Jewish General Hospital got a huge grant to expand its facilities. And one of the major facets of those new facilities at the Jewish General is facilities to treat Montrealers in case of another pandemic, a really big one. And that said, and quite correctly, the big one is coming. We just don't know when. So I think the points that you made are extremely salient. We would like to reach the business community with that message, not just the mining sector, but also the investing community, also the manufacturing community, the rest of the banking community, because they do risk management every day. And these are risks that seem to be off their radar. And I think if they got on board, that would help to counter and deal with the fear you expressed earlier, which was the fear that the Overseas Development Assistance Program will be slashed because it has such a small constituency before elections and everything else. Thank you.
Thank you. Very well said.
Sorry, everyone. I just have to make the message that it's now 7:45. Mr. Martin, I've been told you have to get on a flight and go to the West Coast, so we're going to actually stop the question and answers now. But I invite everybody to adjourn to the beautiful wood-paneled room for cocktails and canapes.
Kyle,
But you have one
I'll
more?
take those 2, and then I'll
Okay.
run, and then I'll be rude.
Okay, I was...
But that's very, thank you. You are a great man.
He knows you know how to do it. Hello, Bill Hartzog. I know you're not an oracle, but I wish you were. It's the comment on the UN resolution 1973, which in some circumstances may be somewhat unique. The Arab League was in favor of it, and it might be construed as having said to the coalition of the willing, then you can protect. However, we now, I think, feel that Russia and China are extremely reluctant to ever buy on again. Just asking you to comment on the current, situation as you see it, in terms of the chance that the Security Council might respond again in a new situation.
Well, my guess would be that Russia and China will do in the very near future what they have done now. But it's very interesting when you talk to the Russians and the Chinese, and you talk about the evolution, and you talk to them about, especially the Chinese, about the prerequisites of leadership, and that how countries who grow wealthy have leadership responsibilities. I actually find that there's a far greater degree of difference of opinion, which means movement, than I think I would have thought. So I would be, not wildly optimistic, but I would be a lot more optimistic. I've got to tell you, I was very surprised by the German reaction. I'm not quite sure I understand it today, but I would be a bit more certainly in the case of the Chinese. The Russians, they've got the Russians have got a fair amount at stake here too, and you would have thought that the Russians would have been a little bit more open. But I'd be very honest, while I've talked to the Chinese, I have not engaged any of the Russians in conversation. But Gordon, you again tomorrow might want to talk about that. Yes.
Well, I thank you as somebody who flew in from the West Coast yesterday to be here. I thank you for holding on. My name is Shana Plout. I'm actually at the University of British Columbia. And prior to being a graduate student, I worked for Amnesty International as a human rights education coordinator. And I also worked with the International Justice and Accountability Program. The reason why I'm saying that is because in those professional capacities, I learned the importance of speaking to different audiences and being able to be persuasive to different audiences. And I applaud you on the honesty that you're talking about making strategic decisions about when to intervene. But I'm wondering how you then weigh that in terms of the different audiences and how a decision to intervene or a decision not to intervene will speak outside of the Canadian context, but also to those countries and populations and diasporas that may or may not be being affected in that way.
You know, again, your analysis is I think, dead on. I just go back. I guess my answer is similar to the one that I gave to Alan Thompson. This isn't a perfect world, and when we're having to write theory, we create the perfect world. But I think people understand that we have to live in a world that isn't perfect, and there are decisions which we can make that work, and there are decisions that we'll have to make that won't work. And I think that, to be quite honest, I think that if you try to clothe that, camouflage it, in other words, if you try to create principle when perhaps you're not acting out of principle as you would, but you are picking your spots because that's the important thing to do, I actually find that people understand it. But I will tell you that it goes back again. You can't be the only person out there explaining that, because you will be suspect. And it takes, that's where you really hope in terms of the press issues that you're dealing with, that the people who are writing this themselves have sufficient skin in the game that they can't just simply pull a populist thing on you, that they really have to deal with it really in depth. And I think if that happens, I think you'll find that people will go along with you, and occasionally they won't, and that's what leadership is all about. But thank you. Okay.